The town watched a young woman kneel in black muck to her elbows, hauling a squealing shoat out of a wall of reeds taller than a man, and every soul on the road agreed she had lost whatever sense the Lord had given her. The water ran green and stinking through that swamp. The reeds hissed in the wind like something alive and displeased, and there she was, up to her forearms in rot, laughing when the hog broke free and knocked her flat into the ooze. They said she had thrown away $70 and a good back on ground even the muskrats had abandoned. What they did not yet know, what none of them could have known that gray afternoon, was that beneath the muck her hogs were rooting up something older than the town itself, something that would one day feed every hungry mouth for 40 miles. But that is the end of the tale, and a tale is worth more told from its beginning, so let us go back. 3 springs earlier, before the hogs, before the mill race, before the town learned to be ashamed, her name was Miriam Vance, and in the spring of her 23rd year, she had exactly $70 folded into the toe of a wool sock, a dead father's watch that did not run, and no one in the world who was obliged to care whether she lived or starved. Her mother had gone when she was 9. Her father, a fence mender and a drinker, had followed the winter past, leaving her a rented room she could not keep, and a reputation as the girl who did a man's labor because no man would keep her fed. She had mended fences beside him since she was 12. She knew posts and wire and the stubbornness of animals, and she knew that a woman alone in that country was reckoned a problem, to be married off or pitied, and Miriam had no wish to be either. So when the county posted the tax forfeit lands for auction that April, she walked the 11 miles to the courthouse in Coldwater and stood in the back of the room in her father's coat. 70 acres along the bottom of Reeder's Slough had gone unclaimed for 19 years. The Reeder family had abandoned it after the second flood took their house 19 years before, and no man since had been fool enough to pay the back taxes on a swamp. The clerk read it out twice and got no bid. $1 an acre, he said, finally, half joking. Is that so much for good bottomland? And Miriam, before her own courage could talk her out of it, said $70. And the room turned to look at her, and someone in the front laughed, the way men laugh when they mean it as a cruelty. She signed her name to the deed with a hand that did not shake, though her heart was going like a hammered nail. The clerk counted her sock money twice, as if suspecting some trick, and stamped the paper, and just like that, Miriam Vance owned more land than her father had owned in his whole roaming life, and every acre of it under water or under reeds. Outside the courthouse, a knot of men stood chewing and watching. One of them, a heavy-set grain factor named Harlan Boyd, who owned the only mill and the only warehouse and half the mortgages in the county, tipped his hat to her with a smile that had no warmth in it. "You'd have done better to sleep in the street," he told her. "At least the street's dry." The others laughed. Miriam folded the deed into her father's coat and walked the 11 miles home in the falling dark, and the deeper the road grew, the more the fear crept up on her, because Boyd was not wrong about the water, and she had not $1 left, and a person cannot eat a deed. But she was not the sort to weep on a road at night. She was the sort to count, and so she counted. 70 acres. No money, 1 coat, 1 broken watch, and 2 hands. The arithmetic came out to nothing at all. And, still, walking, she felt something she could not name. Something like the first breath before a jump, and she decided she would go and look at her land in the morning light before she decided it was hopeless. She went at dawn, with a borrowed spade and no breakfast, and what she found stopped her at the edge of the reeds. The slough was worse than the clerk had said, and better than her fear had painted. The reeds stood in a great choking wall, phragmites the old folks called them, taller than her head, roots woven into a mat so dense she could walk upon it in places without sinking. But where a spring freshet had cut a channel through, the black earth showed itself, and Miriam took up a handful and smelled it, and it did not smell like ruin. It smelled like the bottom of the world, rich and rank and full. Muck soil, her father would have said, if her father had known anything but fences. Land like this, drained and worked, could grow a garden that would shame the uplands. But drained, How by what? With what money? And what mule? And what 40 years of a lone woman's back? She sat on a fallen willow and let the discouragement have its turn. And it was there, mid-morning, that an old man came along the slough edge, driving 3 lean spotted hogs before him with a switch, and stopped, and looked at her, and looked at the reeds, and said in an accent thick as porridge, "So, you are the one who bought the swamp. They are all laughing in the town." Miriam said she supposed they were. The old man nodded slowly, as if that were the most natural thing in the world for a town to do. His name was Tobiah Osk, and he had come out of the old country 40 years before with nothing but a knife and the knowledge of pigs in his hands, and he lived in a sod-roofed cabin a mile up the ridge and kept a dozen hogs and troubled no one. He looked a long time at the reeds, and then he said a thing Miriam would carry the rest of her days. "The land is never worthless," he told her. "Only the eyes are poor. Men see reeds and say nothing grows here. But something grows here, girl. Reeds grow here, and reeds mean water, and under the water is the richest ground God ever laid down, only it is locked, and you have no key." She asked him what the key was, and he grinned with the 3 teeth he had left and pointed his switch at the 3 hogs snuffling along the mud. "There," he said, "there is your plow that costs nothing and works for its own dinner. A hog will root a swamp to the bottom, hunting the tubers and the roots, and where a hog has been, the reed is broken and the ground is turned, and you follow behind and you plant. It is slow, it is filthy, but it is free, and it is sure." Miriam looked at the pigs, and the pigs looked at her, and something in the ridiculous dignity of them, ankle-deep in muck and perfectly content, made her laugh for the first time since the courthouse. Osk sold her 2 bred sows and a boar on the promise of a share of the litters, which was the only currency she had, and he taught her through that first summer the whole slow science of it. How a hog roots not from malice but from hunger, and how that hunger aimed right would clear more ground in a season than a man with a spade could clear in a year. How to run a rough fence of poles and woven reed, to hold them to one patch until it was turned, then move it on. How the pigs would break the root mat, churn the muck, eat the reed shoots down to nothing, and manure the ground as they went, so that behind them lay black-turned earth begging for seed. It was filthy, humbling, endless work. Miriam rose before light and waded the slough in her father's boots. Gone to rot, hauling poles, dragging the fence line forward, foot by foot, pulling the fool animals out of the deep holes they blundered into, day after day after day. Her hands went rough as bark. The town, when she came to Coldwater for salt and nails on credit she could barely get, met her with the same cold amusement. Harlan Boyd, weighing out her flour, remarked that he'd heard she was farming hogs in a swamp, and wasn't that just the thing? Mud, raising mud. She said nothing. She had learned already that being right is its own kind of reply, and that a coal banked low under ash keeps its fire better than one that blazes for every passerby to see. By the second autumn, the sows had littered twice, and the litters had littered, and Miriam had upward of 30 hogs working the slough, and a full 4 acres at the upstream end lay open to the sky, black and turned and drying in the wind where the reeds had stood in a wall the spring before. She planted that first cleared ground to potatoes and cabbage and turnips, because those were the seeds Osk could spare, and the muck soil answered the way he had promised it would answer. The potatoes came up like fists. The cabbages swelled to the size of washpots. She dug that first small harvest by lantern light and stood over it in the cold and did a new arithmetic, and this arithmetic did not come out to nothing. This one came out to enough. Enough to eat through winter, enough to sell a wagon load in Coldwater, enough to buy a real fence and more seed and a young mule with a game leg that no one else wanted, which she bought for $2 and named Job. She told no one in town how well the ground had come. She sold her potatoes plainly and took her coin and banked her fire under the ash, because she had seen how men behave when they suspect a woman alone has found something worth taking, and she meant to be much stronger before that suspicion came. It came anyway, the following year, as such things do, for by the 3rd summer, The Hogs had opened near 30 acres, and Miriam had crops standing in rows where the slough had been, and word travels. A cook came out from the hotel in Coldwater, a broad, sharp woman named Delphine, who ran the only kitchen worth eating in for 40 miles, because she had heard a mad rumor about cabbages the size of washpots and did not believe it. She walked the rows with her hands on her hips, and she picked up one of Miriam's potatoes and turned it in the light and weighed it in her palm, like a jeweler weighing a stone. And she said, well now, I will take every one of these you can dig, and I will pay you what the uplands charge, not what they think a swamp is worth. And she did. And Delphine talked as cooks do, and by the end of that season, half the good tables in the county were eating Miriam Vance's muck-ground vegetables, and not one of the eaters knew or cared that they had all agreed 3 years before that she was mad. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. And so the town simply changed its story and said they'd always known that Bottomland was rich and had only wondered whether the girl had the grit to work it. Harlan Boyd knew the exact worth of what she had, because a grain factor's whole trade is knowing the worth of things before other men see it. He came out in his good buggy that third autumn, all warmth now, and stood at the edge of her drained fields with his thumbs in his vest, and told her he had always admired her spirit. He had a proposal, he said. She was one woman alone, and a woman alone could not hope to hold and work 30 acres of bottom, let alone the 40 still under reed. He would buy the whole tract off her hands, generous terms, and let her stay on and manage it for a wage, so she'd never again worry about drought, nor debt, nor the cruelty of the seasons. He named a figure. It was a great deal more than $70, and Miriam, who had learned to keep her face still, let him think for a moment that she was tempted. Then she asked him why a man so busy would trouble himself over a swamp everyone knew was worthless. Boyd smiled and said land was land, but something moved behind his eyes as he said it, and Miriam remembered it later, and it saved her. For Boyd knew a thing about that bottomland that Miriam did not yet know, and it was not the muck soil, it was water. That summer had come in dry, and the next looked to come in drier, and Harlan Boyd, who dealt in the whole county's grain and held the notes on half its farms, could read a sky as well as old Osk could. A drought was walking toward Coldwater, the way a slow fire walks a field. And Boyd knew that when it came, the creeks that turned his mill and watered the upland farms would fail, and the only water that would not fail was the deep cold water that fed Reeder's slough from some spring far under the ground. Water that had made the swamp a swamp for 100 years, and would go on flowing when every other well in the county ran to dust. He wanted Miriam's 70 acres, not for the vegetables. He wanted them for the water, and for what her hogs had lately begun to uncover at the low end of the slough, in the deepest cut where the reeds had stood thickest of all. Because down there, in the black bottom, the pigs had rooted up cut stone. Miriam had seen the stones that same week and had not understood them. Squared blocks, mortised and pinned, lying in a line beneath the muck where the hogs had opened the deepest ground, and a long straight trench of them running arrow true toward the creek, far too even to be nature's work. She had knelt in the muck, with her hands buried in it, tracing the edges, when old Oss came down the ridge and stood over her, and went very quiet. He knew what it was. In the old country, he had seen the like. This, he said, was a mill race. Long ago, before the Reeders, before the town, someone had built a stone channel here to carry the deep slough water to a wheel, and when they had gone, the reeds had swallowed it whole, and the memory of it had drowned so deep that no living soul recalled a mill had ever stood on Reeder's slough at all. No living soul but one. For Harlan Boyd's own great-grandfather had built it, and the deed to the water right, the ancient right to draw that never-failing spring water and carry it where a man pleased, had passed down in the Boyd family papers, forgotten in a strongbox, until the dry sky reminded Harlan what his family had once owned and lost to a flood and a tax sale years past. So, Boyd's warmth had a bottom of iron to it. When Miriam refused his offer, politely and plainly, saying the land suited her and she meant to keep it, his smile stayed, but his eyes cooled, and within a fortnight the whispers began in Coldwater. That the Vance girl had no true title, that a swamp sold for $1 an acre could not stand up in a court, that there were older claims, water rights, a mill race that proved the ground had never truly been the county's to sell. Boyd did not say these things himself. He let them travel, as he had let the earlier mockery travel, for he understood that a town will carry poison as gladly as it carries praise. And he filed a quiet claim at the courthouse asserting his family's ancient water right over the whole flow of Reeder's Slough, which, if the judge upheld it, would let him drain every drop of that deep spring water down his rediscovered stone race, to his own mill and his own dry uplands, and leave Miriam 30 acres of muck, with nothing to keep it from cracking to dust the moment the drought closed its hand. And then the drought came, exactly as Boyd had read it would. The spring rains failed. The summer came down like the open door of a furnace and stayed. By July, the creeks that turned the county's mills ran to threads and then to stone, and the upland wells sank and the corn curled brown in the fields, and the cattle bawled at dry troughs, and Coldwater, which had laughed at a girl for buying a swamp, began to understand what it means to be a town without water. Farm after farm went to Boyd's notes, for a man cannot pay a mortgage with a dead field, and Harlan Boyd, who had money and patience and a strong box full of old paper, prepared to become the master of the whole parched county. Only one place in 40 miles stayed green. Miriam's slough, fed by its deep unfailing spring, ran cold and clear down its ancient stone throat while the world above it burned, and her drained fields drank that water through the ditches her hogs had rooted, and her cabbages swelled and her potatoes fattened and her hogs grew sleek. And the smell of turned wet black earth hung over her 30 acres like a promise in a land of dust. The court set the water right hearing for the 3rd week of August in the worst heat of it. Boyd's lawyer laid out the Boyd family papers, the deed of the water right, the map of the old mill race, and argued smoothly that the ancient right ran with the Boyd blood down from his great-grandfather and not with the tax-sold land, and that Miss Vance had bought muck and reeds, but never the water beneath them. It was a fine argument, and the courtroom, sweating and frightened and thirsty, was half inclined to believe anything that might turn some water toward their dying fields. Miriam sat in her father's coat, with old Osk beside her, and Delphine, the cook, behind her, and she had no lawyer, for she had spent her coin on seed and hogs, and not on men in good suits. But she had spent the long nights before the hearing doing the one thing she had always done, which was to count, and to observe, and to reason her way to the value no one else could see. And, when the judge asked whether she wished to speak, she stood. She did not shout. She had never learned to shout. She said, plainly, that Mr. Day. Boyd's papers spoke of a right to carry the slough water down the old stone race to the wheel. His great-grandfather built. She had read them carefully, she said, and she agreed. The papers were true and the right was real. Then she asked the court a question. She asked where the old wheel had stood and where the race had ended, for a water right, she had learned, was a right to carry water from one place to another named place, and not a right to steal a whole spring and send it wherever a man now wishes. And she unrolled a map of her own, drawn by her own hand from her own hog's digging, showing that the ancient race did not run toward Boyd's distant mill at all. It ran to a mill site at the low corner of her own land, where the pigs had rooted up the stone footings of a wheel pit that had drowned a century before. The right, if it ran anywhere, ran to a mill that stood on her 70 acres. And that mill, and its footings, and the deep spring that fed it, had all been sold fair and square by the county for $70. To her, the courtroom went very still. Boyd's lawyer began to object, and Boyd himself, red and sweating, half rose and said the thing that ruined him, said it before he could stop his own tongue. He said, "That mill was pulled down before anyone living can recall. How did you know the count of the footings?" And Miriam looked at him a long moment, and the whole room understood at once that Harlan Boyd had walked her land in the dark and counted stones he swore he had never seen, that he had known all along exactly what the pigs had uncovered and exactly what it was worth, and that his warm offer and his cool whispers and his ancient papers had all been one long-reaching hand after a girl's water in a dying ear. The judge, who was thirsty too and who did not love to be made a tool of, ruled that the water right ran to the mill site where the race in fact ended, which was on the Vance land, and that Miriam Vance held title to the ground, the stone, the mill, and the spring alike. Boyd sat down and did not rise again. Outside, the sun hammered the dust, and inside, for the first time, no one laughed. Now here is where the tale might have ended in simple triumph, with the scorned girl proven right and the greedy man shamed, and that would have been a fair ending, and a true one. But a person's worth is not shown in the hour. They are proven right. It is shown in what they choose to do with being right. And Miriam Vance walked out of that courtroom the only person in 40 miles who owned water in a drought, which is to say, she walked out able to make herself rich past counting, or to make herself the new Harlan Boyd, doling the county's own thirst back to it at whatever cruel price a dying farmer would pay. She rode home to the green slough in the burning dark, and sat on the same fallen willow where she had once let discouragement have its turn, and she counted. Only now the arithmetic came out to more than enough. It came out to more than one woman could ever spend, and that, she found, frightened her worse than the nothing had. Old Osk found her there at dawn as he had found her 3 years before, and he did not need to ask what troubled her. The land is never worthless, he said again gently. Only the eyes are poor, and a person, girl, is the same. Miriam thought a long while, and then she knew what she would do, because it was the only thing that let her keep her own face when she looked at it. She did not hoard the water. She had the mill race cleaned out and re-timbered a wheel, using Boyd's own grandfather's stone, and she set the deep spring to turning it, and she opened a channel along the ridge that carried the never-failing water out to the dying upland farms. Farm after farm after farm, the very farms whose owners had laughed at her in the courthouse yard. She charged for it. She was no fool and no saint, and water and work are worth their price. But she charged the same fair figure to the man who had jeered loudest as to the widow who had once pitied her, and she carried some to the poorest on no more surety than a handshake and a promise for after the rains returned. A thing is only worth what others will pay, Boyd had once told her. She had learned a deeper arithmetic than that. A thing is worth what it does, and water that saves a county is worth more given fairly than sold cruel. The rains came back the next spring, as rains do, but the county did not forget the summer it had lived, only because a girl's hogs had rooted a swamp down to an old mill race, and a girl's stubbornness had kept the water free to the ones who once mocked her. Harlan Boyd left the county owing more warmth than money, his notes bought up quietly, it was said, by a woman in a dead man's coat who never once mentioned it to him. Delphine the cook and Miriam grew old friends. The child of the drowned widow, a thin boy named Pete, who had come begging water in the worst of it, stayed on and learned the hogs and the ground and the science of the muck, and became to Miriam what she had once been to old Osk, the pair of young hands. The work is finally handed down to, and Osk himself lived long enough to walk the green rows one last autumn, leaning on Miriam's arm, and to say, so, before he went, it was that, only that. And if you were to ride through that country now, along the road where a town once stood and laughed, you would come upon 70 acres that no map calls a swamp anymore. You would see black fields, heavy with more food than the county can eat, and a stone wheel turning slow and patient on water that has never once failed, and hogs, sleek and ridiculous and content, rooting the last of the reeds down to the good ground the way their great-grandsires did. And if you stopped and asked the woman working there, gray now and strong as a fence post, how it was that the one place spared in the great drought had been the very ground her neighbors swore was worthless, she would likely say nothing clever at all. She would only push her hair from her eyes with a hand rough as bark, and look out over the green she had coaxed from the rot, and tell you what an old man with 3 teeth once told a frightened girl on a fallen willow. The land is never worthless. Only the eyes are poor, and then she would go back to her hogs and let the tale, as tales do, keep itself.